Episode 26, Part 02, Chapter 26. Part 2, Cloud's Memory. Chapter 26. Cloud moved to the back of the pickup truck that was carrying them along, and looked out of the back window. It was hard to see out because of the rain that was falling down outside, falling thick and fast onto the window and covering it completely. No sooner did the wipers at the front and back of the car wipe the rain away did more fall down onto it, making it almost impossible to see out. From what he could make out, the sky was dark and dreary, the clouds so low they almost touched the tips of the mountains he could see in the distance. "It sure is raining hard," he commented, before turning back to the other people sitting patiently in the car as it drove on. Sitting in the car were two Shinra soldiers and another man, with another soldier driving the truck at the front. The soldier furthest from him was sat patiently with his gun in his hand as they moved on, not paying any attention to him at all. The nearest soldier sat on the crate beside him was sat anxiously with his hands cupped together, trembling a little. He didn't really seem that well at all. The third person was sat at the other end of the truck on another crate, and it was clear just from looking at him that he was a strong and well-respected individual. He was dressed fairly smartly in a black and white outfit that was mostly covered by a long black cloak that covered him from his shoulders to his feet, with two large pieces of shoulder armor on either shoulder. His hair was so long it ran all the way down his back, and was colored a beautiful shade of silver. His skin was fairly pale, which was natural considering his hair color, while his eyes were a stunning green, with the same glow in them that Cloud's eyes had. By his side was the long, curved sword that only he could use, the Masamune. At that moment he was looking down in thought, not noticing what Cloud was doing. This was the man that started everything. The man that killed the Shinra president and probably many others as well. This was Sephiroth. Cloud moved away from the window and towards the soldier closest to him. The poor Shinra soldier looked very uncomfortable clad in the blue uniform, and was constantly twitching and shifting about on the crate in which he was sat. Cloud felt incredibly sorry for him, having to sit about in his uniform and helmet like that, unable to go outside for some fresh air to clear his head. "How are you doing?" he asked the soldier kindly, leaning over to him. The soldier looked up, his face invisible through the darkness of the helmet. "I'm all right," he muttered quietly, his voice shaking a little with his nausea. "I wouldn't know," Cloud admitted, standing upright. He folded his arms and thought for a moment or two. "I've never had motion sickness." He then left the motion sick soldier and went to the front of the truck, and waved to the second Shinra soldier. "Everything okay?" he asked. The soldier just looked at him, and then looked away again, uninterested. Cloud didn't mind, and walked back to the center of the moving vehicle. He folded his arms once again. 2 years ago he would never have dreamed that he would actually have made it into soldier, let alone be working so closely with Sephiroth. Many soldiers dreamed of meeting the great Sephiroth, let alone work with him. It made Cloud very excited, and no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't keep still. His excitement surpassed everything else, including the dreary rain, and nothing could take him off the cloud he was on right then. "Hey," came a voice. Cloud turned towards Sephiroth in surprise, and saw that Sephiroth was looking at him. It was the first time he had spoken throughout their whole journey towards the quiet town they were heading towards. Sephiroth's glowing green eyes seemed to give off an aura of supremacy and power, as though a strong power was buried within him. It was no wonder he was known as the Great Sephiroth, when you looked into those eyes and saw that power and strength there. "Settle down," Sephiroth told Cloud. His voice was calm and almost emotionless. It was easier said than done for Cloud. With his excitement building, he began to squat up and down in the middle of the truck, somehow managing to maintain his balance while the truck moved across the bumpy road, which made the poor Shinra soldier behind him feel even more sick. All the while Sephiroth watched him blankly, unmoved by Cloud's apparent excitement. "They gave me some new materia," Cloud boasted as he squatted breathlessly in front of Sephiroth. "I can't wait to use it." A small smile spread across Sephiroth's face, and he laughed a little. "Just like a kid," he remarked, meaning Cloud's constant change of position. It was nothing new to him to get some new materia. But Cloud, who was still just a rookie in soldier despite making first class, was still excited at the thought of new materia. Cloud finally stopped squatting and looked at Sephiroth. "You going to brief us about this mission?" he asked, finally changing the subject to something more practical. "This isn't an ordinary mission," Sephiroth began. "Good!" Cloud exclaimed, immediately interrupting him. Sephiroth tilted his head and looked at Cloud in surprise. "Why do you say that?" he asked him. "I joined soldier so I could be like you," Cloud explained to him briefly. He turned away and looked up at the ceiling. "But by the time I made first class, the war was over. My big hopes of becoming a hero like you ended with the war. That's why I always sign up whenever there's a big mission. Kind of a way to prove myself." He turned back to Sephiroth, a kind of smug smile on his face. "Say, how do you feel, Mr. Sephiroth?" Sephiroth sighed heavily. "I thought you wanted a briefing?" he asked. Cloud fell silent and his face went red as he scratched the back of his head, slightly embarrassed at letting his excitement get the better of him. Realizing that Cloud was finally ready to listen, Sephiroth tried again. "Our mission is to investigate an old Mako reactor. There have been reports of it malfunctioning and producing brutal creatures. First, we will dispose of those creatures. Then, we'll locate the problem and neutralize it." Cloud folded his arms once again, and tapped his foot thoughtfully against the floor of the truck. "Brutal creatures?" he wondered aloud. He looked at Sephiroth. "Where?" he asked. "The Mako reactor at Nibelheim," Sephiroth told him, sitting back on the crate and looking down once again at the floor. Cloud looked up in surprise at the name of the town they were heading to. "Nibelheim?" he repeated. "That's where I'm from." Sephiroth mumbled quietly to himself. "Hometown." At that moment there was a loud crash outside as something large and heavy suddenly slammed into the side of the truck, causing it to shake violently. Cloud and the two soldiers all jumped violently and looked around as the shaking ceased, wondering what had just happened. "Sir," the driver of the truck said fearfully, turning to look into the back of the truck. Something just crashed into our truck." Everyone turned to the back window as a large shadow then descended on the truck and covered it in blackness. Through the heavy rain that was pelting against the back window, they could just about see a large silhouette fly down and land on the ground behind the truck. They couldn't see what it was that had just crashed into them, but from the size of the shadow and the silhouette, it must have been something pretty big. Sephiroth stood up off the crate, holding his mass immune. "That would be our monster," he said. He moved swiftly to the back of the truck and unlocked the two doors, pushing them open. As the door opened, a powerful gust of wind blew into the truck, making the crates shudder and slide towards the front of the truck. With the wind came the rain, which fell into the doorway and onto Sephiroth's face as he stood in the doorway of the truck. The raindrops rolled down his face and dripped off the ends of his hair. Yet, for some strange reason, he wasn't getting completely soaked. It was as though some magical resistance was preventing the raindrops from fully touching his skin and merely skimming over the top of a magical layer. Beside him, Cloud was shivering slightly from the biting cold of the wind, and the raindrops soaking his skin and hair. He didn't have that same unknown resistance that Sephiroth did. The two looked through the rain to the dark, dry lands behind them, and saw the monster that they had been looking for. It was a large green dragon, which had just surfaced to begin hunting for its prey. The dragon had a fairly small head but a large and powerful body, and two large wings protruding from its back. Its most formidable weapon was of course its head, for that's where its fangs were, as well as where fire came out. It truly was a fierce beast, and it was no wonder that soldiers were called out to dispose of it. Cloud stared up at the dragon in awe, for he had never seen a monster so big in all his life. He had of course seen monsters before, and had fought and killed many during his training and service, but not many monsters were allowed to grow as large as this dragon was. They posed a huge threat to the people, and were usually destroyed before they could get huge. This one, however, had somehow defied all that, and towered well above the truck and the pitiful soldiers inside it. Grabbing onto his powerful Buster sword, Cloud prepared to do his duty and go out to fight the dragon. Before he could step out of the door, a hand suddenly blocked his path and prevented him from passing. Cloud turned to the hand's owner, and stared at Sephiroth in surprise. The older soldier just shook his head, and then lowered his arm, walking out of the door of the truck and into the storm, heading right for the dragon that was stopping them from getting to Nibelheim. The dragon looked down at Sephiroth through his tiny red eyes, and growled. It was able to find him better with its ears and nose rather than its eyes, which were weaker, and was able to figure out exactly where Sephiroth was standing, and could smell that he was live prey. Sephiroth was standing right in the open, and was in plain view of the dragon. Seeing that Sephiroth was an easy open target, the dragon rose up on its hind legs and lifted its head up high. A swarm of hot flames began to grow inside of its mouth, and as it lowered its head it spat out a long spray of red flames that flew down towards Sephiroth in a long, fiery stream. Inside the truck, Cloud and the other soldiers winced and shielded their eyes from the flames. Sephiroth, on the other hand, didn't flinch or move as the flames headed towards him. As the flames approached, he raised his long Masamune sword and held it out upright in front of him as a blockade from the flames. It didn't seem like much of a defense, but as the flames hit him, the sword seemed to act as a magical barrier. The flames spread out from where they hit the flat side of the sword and around Sephiroth, not getting anywhere near his skin and merely skimming past him. Cloud lowered his arm slightly and stared in amazement. The last of the flames flew past and disappeared into the air, and Sephiroth lowered his sword, not a single burn mark on him. The dragon stared down in surprise, not expecting its attack to be deflected like that. Sephiroth then clasped his sword in both hands and ran forward towards the dragon, bringing his sword back in preparation for a powerful attack, ready to take on the dragon single-handed. The dragon stood no chance against the awesome power of Sephiroth. When he was close enough, Sephiroth swung his long Masamune skillfully, and the dragon gave a loud and anguished cry of defeat. That one single stroke from the Masamune was powerful enough to kill anything instantly, and the blade delved so deep into the creature's body it did the damage that was needed, in just one single hit. The dragon fell down onto the floor in a heap, defeated. As its head crashed onto the wet, rocky floor it turned and glanced at Sephiroth through its dying red eyes. It gave one last anguished cry before it fell silent. The monster had been defeated in just one hit, and not a single mark had been left on Sephiroth. Sephiroth lowered his sword, and Cloud could only watch and stare in awe.
Sephiroth's strength is unreal, Cloud explained to the group, closing his eyes as he remembered the battle. He could still feel the immense awe he felt then, so long ago. He is far stronger in reality than any story you might have heard about him. So, where do you come in?
Asked Aris.
Me?
Asked Cloud, scratching his head.
I was mesmerized by the way Sephiroth fought.
To one side, Tifa slowly turned away and looked out of the bedroom window. Was all she could muster to say. Talking about Sephiroth brought back bad memories for her as well as other worries she didn't like to voice. Instead, she just decided to sit quietly and listen to Cloud's story in silence, and remember herself.
And then we reached Nibelheim,
said Cloud, finally ready to continue the story. Not long after they had defeated the dragon in the mountain plains, the truck crossed into the plains where the town of Nibelheim was built. The town itself was built at the entrance to the large mountains that covered the land behind it and moved on to the next section of the continent. Nibelheim was like a guard, guarding the entrance to the mountain paths, although few dared to enter. Sephiroth was the first to pass through the gates of Nibelheim and stand in the entrance of the town. He looked around at the quiet streets. The people were in hiding, afraid of the monster. He saw the old well in the center of the town, and the path leading up towards the mountains beyond. There wasn't a single person in sight, and looked pretty much like a deserted ghost town. Sephiroth turned to the entrance, back to Cloud.
How does it feel?
He asked Cloud curiously. Cloud looked back at him, confused.
It's your first time back to your hometown in a long time, right? So how does it feel? I wouldn't know because I don't have a hometown.
Cloud blinked in puzzlement.
How about your parents?
He asked, finding it a little hard to believe that someone could not have a hometown. Across from him, Sephiroth crossed his arms and looked down in thought.
My mother is Genova,
he said.
She died right after giving birth to me. My father.
He fell silent for a moment. He then suddenly began to laugh, and put a hand over his mouth to try and stop himself. He then managed to stop and took a breath, before shaking his head.
What does it matter?
He asked. He turned towards the town.
All right, let's go.
Cloud and the other two Shinra soldiers all walked up to the town entrance, until Cloud came to a stop just a few meters behind Sephiroth. It had been 2 years since he had seen Nibelheim. It hadn't changed one bit since he left. The well, the houses. Even the old broken-down truck in the corner by the entrance was there. After he had finished his few moments of nostalgia, he turned back to Sephiroth, and headed up into the silent town of Nibelheim.
Yo, wait a minute.
Barret interrupted suddenly, breaking the mood. Everyone turned to him.
Isn't that,
He scratched the back of his head, trying to sort out his own confusion.
The name of Sephiroth's mother. I remember Genova. That's that dumb headless spook livin' in the Shinra building.
Cloud nodded.
That's right.
Tifa finally came away from the window and sat as far back on the bed as she could.
Barret, would you please listen to what Cloud has to say?
She asked him curtly, folding her arms against her chest.
You can ask questions later.
Barret tried to protest.
Tifa, I was only... Okay Cloud,
Tifa said, ignoring Barret.
Continue. It's a reunion of childhood pals!" exclaimed Eris.
Cloud nodded and began to continue.
"I was really surprised with Tifa," he admitted.
He glanced over at Tifa, but she had once again turned to the window and was looking out at calm.
"The town was quiet. Everyone must be staying in their homes, afraid to come out because of the monsters. No, maybe they're afraid of us."
Cloud and Sephiroth passed through the gates of Nibelheim and into the town center, where all the main houses and shops were based. All the shops were shut up, apart from the inn, which was the only building with the lights switched on. They stopped just outside the entrance to the inn, with the two soldiers standing nearby.
"We leave for the reactor at dawn,"
Sephiroth explained to Cloud, all the laughter now gone and he had returned to his usual, serious self. Cloud nodded, and Sephiroth turned to the two soldiers.
"All we need is one lookout, so you others, get some rest."
He turned towards the inn when he suddenly remembered something, and stopped.
"Oh, that's right."
He turned back to the side, glancing at Cloud.
"You may visit your family and friends."
With that, Sephiroth went into the inn and walked confidently inside, letting the door fall shut behind him. One of the two soldiers followed him in, leaving Cloud and the remaining soldier standing outside in the middle of the street. When they were gone, the soldier began to shuffle anxiously.
"Man, I'm nervous,"
he said suddenly. He sounded nervous, too. Cloud looked at him.
"How come?"
he asked. The soldier stopped shuffling about and looked at Cloud, his face almost invisible through the helmet he was wearing.
"Look, you never know when a monster's gonna show up, right?"
he pointed out. Cloud nodded, understanding what he meant. Since the breakdown of the Nibelheim reactor, many monsters had appeared in the town. The citizens of Nibelheim were all in hiding, and it was their job to vanquish that fear. He turned away from the soldier and across the town, in particular to a set of houses at the far end of the town square. He remembered them both so well. One of them belonged to the Lockhart family, a well-respected family in Nibelheim. The other house, just next door, belonged to Cloud's family. Cloud headed towards it and stopped outside the door hesitantly.
"This is my house,"
Cloud said, stopping.
"It has nothing to do with that incident 5 years ago." "Yo, wait, I wanna hear,"
said Barrett.
"Me too,"
said Eris.
"It's been a long time, right? Tell us more,"
Barrett urged, pressing Cloud to continue.
"You saw your family, right?"
Cloud looked at the eager faces of Eris and Barrett, and saw that there was no way he was going to be able to avoid talking about what happened when he went home for the first time. He sighed heavily, giving in.
"All right,"
he said.
"I don't know if you could call it a family. My father died when I was still very young. That's why my mom was living alone in this house."
He closed his eyes, remembering.
"Yeah, I saw my mom. My mom. She was a vibrant woman. Hadn't changed at all. But a few days later she died. But when I saw her, she looked fine."
End of chapter. Episode 27, Part 02, Chapter 27. Chapter 27. Cloud grasped onto the door handle of his house. For some reason he felt extremely nervous about going in and seeing his mom again. It had been 2 years since he had left Nibelheim to join Soldier, and had barely been in contact with anyone from Nibelheim since then. It was a very nervous thing to do, to return home after being gone for such a long time. Eventually he pushed away all that anxiety and opened the door, and headed inside the house. The first thing he noticed was the familiar smell of baking, at least someone was in the house. It was a smell he was very used to, and as he sniffed the air he found that he had missed it very much. As he stepped into the main living room he found that very little had changed at all, and everything was left exactly the way it had been when he had left it 2 years before. The beds were in the same place with the same old sheets, and the kitchen was still as it should be. The scent of baking had filled the whole house just as it always did, and yet Cloud still felt like an outsider. His mom was standing with her back to him at the far end of the room, doing something over in the corner that Cloud couldn't see. She was fairly old now, and her blonde hair was beginning to show the faint streaks of gray that showed her age. As she heard the door close, she looked up and turned towards Cloud. It was clear that she didn't recognize him at that moment, for she squinted through her old eyes as she tried to make out who it was, rubbing her hands with an old cloth. Cloud muttered nervously. He scratched the back of his head, unsure of what he should say to his mom.
Yes?
She asked, still not realizing who he was. She stared at him for a few seconds more, before her blue eyes opened wide and a large smile spread on her old face. She threw her cloth down onto the floor and dashed towards him. She stopped beside him and put her hands on Cloud's face, as though to make sure that he really was there.
Cloud?
She exclaimed, the smile just getting larger. Cloud nodded.
Welcome home, Cloud.
Cloud nodded again, still nervous.
Hi, Mom,
he said. Flash. Moments later Cloud's mom had him standing in the middle of the room and was walking around him in a tight circle. She wanted to see every inch of her son and see just how he had changed since he left. 2 years ago, when he left in the truck taking new recruits to Midgar, Cloud had been a small, fairly slim little boy. Now he was taller and looked much stronger. Still, being the mother she was, she had to make sure.
Come. Let me take a look at you,
she said as she walked around, inspecting him. Cloud did as he was told and didn't move while his mother walked around with her usual concerned smile on her face as she looked him up and down. She looked up into Cloud's face, and smiled.
You look so handsome. So this is a soldier uniform?
Cloud looked at his mom.
Mom,
Flash.
My, how you've grown,
said his mom.
I'll bet the girls never leave you alone.
Cloud didn't look up from the bed and continued to stare up at the ceiling. As he lay there his mother walked around the perimeter of the bed, looking him over with a gentle smile on her fair, slightly old face. She was not as strong as she used to be, but she still seemed as vibrant as ever. Cloud sighed heavily.
Not really,
he replied lazily, still refusing to get up. Mrs. Strife looked at him with a flash of concern.
I'm worried about you,
she admitted. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked right up beside her son.
There are a lot of temptations in the city. I'd feel a lot better if you just settled down and had a nice girlfriend. I'm all right,
Cloud said. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He then sighed, completely relaxed on the soft, familiar bed. Still his mother wouldn't quit.
You should have an older girlfriend,
she said, thinking hard.
One that'll take care of you. I think that would be the perfect type for you. I'm not interested.
Flash.
Are you eating right?
Cloud's mother asked for what must have been the 100th time.
She was only concerned for the welfare of her son, but Cloud was beginning to tire of the question.
I'm all right,
he assured her, also for the 100th time.
The company takes care of me. Is that so?
His mother asked, folding her arms and thinking hard.
You can cook, right? I was worried sick about how you were doing.
Flash. Mrs. Strife turned.
Cloud?
Flash.
You know, Cloud.
Flash.
Isn't that right, Cloud?
Flash. She turned again.
I will always be your mother. Let's stop this.
Cloud interrupted suddenly, turning away. He couldn't bear to walk about his mother anymore. Remembering her now was just too painful. No one contradicted him, and by this point both Barrett and Eris both wished they hadn't pressed so hard to make him tell them what happened, especially since his mother was now dead. So they all waited patiently for a few more minutes while Cloud recomposed himself, and was ready to continue the story. After Cloud was done in his own house he left. He was going to go straight to the inn where Sephiroth would be waiting for him, but instead he stayed outside for a while longer and slowly headed over towards the house next door to his, where the Lockharts, where Tifa lived. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer from inside. As he pushed on the door he found it unlocked, so he thought that someone must have been in. So he walked inside.
Cloud?
Tifa asked suddenly, speaking up for the first time and looking at Cloud. Cloud looked over expectantly. She seemed a little hesitant, but asked the question anyway.
Did you go into my house?
Cloud nodded.
Yeah.
He answered.
I thought you might be home.
In the hallway, Cloud began to brush himself off before he went in. Again, it had been a long time since he had been anywhere near this house, and a long time since he had seen Tifa, and he wanted to look his best at least if she was in. Once he was sure he was clean he walked into the main hall. He couldn't remember much what Tifa's house looked like on the inside, but it seemed pretty homely and normal enough. It was more packed than his house, and there was a large table in the middle of the dining room where Tifa and her father would sit and eat their meals. There was no smell of baking in this house, and just seemed like an ordinary family home. There was no sign of Tifa on the ground floor, so Cloud headed on upstairs, wondering if Tifa was maybe in her room.
Cloud?
Tifa interrupted again.
Did you go into my room? Yeah,
said Cloud. Cloud walked into Tifa's room, at first only peeking around the door in case she wasn't expecting him to come. It was common knowledge that Shinra were coming to fix the reactor and kill the monsters that were invading the town, but he was surprised that Tifa hadn't come to meet them, to see if Cloud was amongst them or not. He hadn't written to her, but they did make a promise before he left. Looking around the comforts of Tifa's tidy bedroom, Cloud could see that she wasn't inside either. The house was completely empty apart from him. Realizing that he was the only one in the house, Cloud felt strangely a little more relaxed. He wouldn't have known what to say to Tifa anyway. He walked more fully into the bedroom and looked around, still feeling like an outcast that had never set foot there before. Her room was pretty plain but comfortable, with a large bed in the corner with a few teddies resting on top of it. There was a dressing table and a desk, and even a piano in the corner beside her bed,
with a single song sheet resting on it. He didn't remember Tifa ever being able to play the piano. Cloud took a few moments to look around the room. He headed over to the window and looked out at the town center below, which was still quiet. He could see the inn clearly, and he knew that he should be heading back soon. But before he left, he headed over to Tifa's desk, wondering if he should leave a note to say that he had been there. As he reached the desk, he saw a letter lying on the desk, and for a moment, he thought he saw his name on it. So, curious, he picked it up.
The letter,
Cloud muttered quietly, running a hand through his hair.
Did you read it? My letter?
Yet, replied Cloud, still thinking.
You remember what it said?
Cloud turned away and thought for a moment, still trying to recall everything that was said. He then nodded and turned back.
I remember clearly, he answered. I read it. It was a letter addressed to Tifa from the son of the guy that runs the general store.
Tifa, how are you? I just arrived in Midgar 8 days ago. Yesterday, all of Nibelheim got together to welcome me. The only person that we couldn't get a hold of was Cloud. But everyone said he wasn't really that close to us. So even if he asked, he probably wouldn't have come anyway. Well, enough about him. Midgar is really something. But to tell you the truth, I feel so behind on everything. So out of it. Even the rooms of people in the slums are clean. Right now I'm living in the slums, but I plan to move to a really nice room, like the ones I've seen in magazines, once I make some money. But to do that, I have to find a job first. That's right. I still haven't found a job yet. I lied to my parents and told them I found a great job with Shinra Incorporated. I wonder if it's too late to go back. Sometimes I think I should have taken over my parents' store. Cloud paused for a moment, still trying to recall everything. Noticing that he had stopped, Tifa looked at him.
Cloud, do you remember all of it?
She asked him. Slowly, Cloud nodded.
Yeah, I remember it all,
he said.
Because there was some stuff about me.
I just made it here to Midgar, but all I think about is Nibelheim. Hey, Tifa. Is that stupid old water tower still working? Is the old man at the inn doing well? Are my parents still at the shop every day? Have any monsters attacked? And most of all, how are you, Tifa? It feels like I haven't seen you for years. We were talking about you last night. Everyone likes you. But because everyone idolizes you, I couldn't very well stab them in the back. I always acted cool, but actually, I was afraid of being jilted. Wow, if I keep writing like this, this'll become a love letter. So, I think I'll stop here. Take care. I'll write again. P.S. Write me back, okay? After finishing the letter, Cloud put it back on the desk and very quickly left Tifa's room, feeling that he had intruded enough on her privacy for one day, and it was absolutely clear that she was not in the house where he had expected her to be. So he headed down the stairs and out of the door, back onto the lonely, empty Nibelheim streets. There was no sign of the single Shinra soldier as he left Tifa's house, just as there was no sign of anyone on the streets. They were all still too scared to come out, which was probably enhanced with Shinra's presence in the town. Shinra may have supplied the town with power and some money from the Nibelheim reactor, but everyone knew their military strength. There was nothing else left for Cloud to do, so he headed briskly towards the inn. He felt very relieved as he walked into the inn, feeling a little more comfortable now. He had been away from Nibelheim for so long he felt more like a visitor than a citizen, and was glad to be out of the plain view of the people in their houses. An old man was standing behind the desk inside the inn, and was busy on a crossword puzzle in a newspaper that he was reading. Another man was standing in the corner, with his back to Cloud. The old man behind the desk only looked up briefly as Cloud entered, before turning back to his puzzle.
The whole inn's booked up by Shinra for the night,
he told Cloud, and continued to do his puzzle. Then he stopped. He put down his pen and looked up at Cloud, narrowing his old eyes so he could see a little more clearly. He blinked.
Cloud? Is it you, Cloud?
Cloud nodded.
It must be been 2 years. Say, you've really moved up in the world, being under Sephiroth's command.
He folded up his newspaper and put it on the shelves under the desk.
So, what do you need, Cloud?
Cloud crossed his arms and leaned against the desk.
Let me know the situation of the town,
he asked. He should at least get up to date on the situation.
Now about the town,
the old man commented, taking off his glasses.
A lot of monsters have been appearing in the last 12 months. Nothing much exciting happens in a little town like this. It was all right when they were building the reactor, while they were still building it. But once it was completed, it's been bad. Within a few years, all the trees on the mountain have withered away. I don't know if the reactor was good or bad. I mean, it's easy to say that it was a bad idea now. But now, what can you do about it?
He put his glasses back on and reached for his paper.
Anyhow, we've got to get rid of the monsters. Then, we'll all be able to relax a little bit.
Cloud nodded, understanding what the old man was talking about. There were many towns now where reactors had been built, and in every one the land had begun to wither away, and all the life disappearing from it. Of course Shinra denied there being a link between the reactors and the state of the land, but people still believed it to be the fault of Shinra, and blamed them for it. But there was nothing anyone could really do about it. He pushed himself up away from the desk.
Where's Sephiroth?
He asked. He had gotten enough information for one day. The old man nodded his head to the staircase.
Yeah, he's upstairs,
he said.
Give me a room to stay.
The old inn owner shook his head.
It's all reserved for you Shinra people, so I don't mind,
he informed Cloud. He took his glasses off again.
But, wouldn't you find it more comfortable staying at home?
Cloud looked down at the ground, going red a little. The innkeeper seemed to understand at that point and said no more, instead turning towards his paper and continuing to tackle his tricky crossword puzzle. Cloud was about to head upstairs to his room, when another deep voice suddenly spoke out to him.
HMMMMM? Is Shinra here to get rid of the monsters?
Surprised, Cloud stopped and turned back. The man who had been standing in the corner had now turned towards Cloud, and Cloud could see him more clearly. He was very peculiar looking, with large muscles and a cloak tied around his neck. Even with his strange appearance, Cloud got the impression that it wasn't a good idea to point this out.
And who are you?
Cloud asked. The strange-looking man flicked his cloak behind him and stood proudly.
I'm Zangan,
he said, his voice full of pride in himself.
I travel around the world teaching children martial arts.
All of a sudden he leaped up into the air, flying directly over Cloud until he landed on the floor on the opposite side. Cloud stared in amazement, unable to believe that someone with such a strong, heavy frame as his should be able to jump as though he was as light as a feather. Zhang Gan flicked his cloak back again and turned to Cloud, the pride showing on his face, and he wasn't finished yet.
I have 128 students all over the world,
he boasted, and crossed his arms.
In this town, a girl named Tifa is my student.
That caught Cloud's attention.
Did you say Tifa?
He demanded, going right up to Zhang Gan. Zhang Gan was pleased with the reaction.
Tifa has good sense,
he told Cloud.
She'll be a powerful fighter.
He suddenly jumped up again and flew over Cloud's head, landing expertly on the floor behind him, where he had originally stood. He then clenched his fists, ready for battle.
I want to see some Shinra techniques. And if you see anything you can use, you might want to incorporate some of my techniques.
He lowered his arms and gave a little wave.
Well, good luck.
Zhang Gan then turned away from Cloud and back towards the notice boards, muttering quietly to himself once again. Cloud decided this was probably a good time to make his escape, and very hurriedly made his way back upstairs towards the first floor of the inn. He was surprised to find Sephiroth standing outside of the inn's room and standing beside a window, looking out at the scenery beyond. Cloud walked up and stood beside him.
What are you looking at?
He asked Sephiroth. There was a creak on the stairs behind him as the soldier assigned to look out came up the stairs and went into the bedroom. Sephiroth didn't turn, and continued to look out.
This scenery,
he said.
I feel like I know this place.
Cloud looked out of the window to where Sephiroth was looking. There wasn't much to see. All that could be seen was the dry, dead mountains and the dead patches of land that surrounded them, as well as the site of the old mansion built at the north of the town. And Sephiroth had never been to Nibelheim before, so there was no explanation as to why it was so familiar to him. Eventually, Sephiroth sighed and turned to Cloud.
We have an early start tomorrow. You should get some sleep,
he said. Cloud nodded.
Yeah, let's get some sleep. I've hired a guide to the Mako reactor,
Sephiroth explained.
I've heard she's young. I hope we can rely on her.
He turned back to the window, lost in his thoughts again. While he was thinking, Cloud headed towards the bedrooms, thinking about who the young girl was. He had a terrible feeling he knew who it was, but he hoped that he was wrong. End of chapter. Episode 28, Part 02, Chapter 28. Chapter 28. The following morning the door to the inn burst open and Cloud ran out, cursing himself for sleeping so late when he had a job to do. Sephiroth was a very patient person, but he wouldn't wait for those who couldn't be bothered to show up on time. As he ran out of the inn and turned towards the north of the town, the door to the shop next door also opened and a young boy ran out holding a camera, and followed Cloud eagerly towards the north sector of the town. To Cloud's immense relief, Sephiroth was waiting for him at the top of the town, standing near to the entrance of the old mansion that guarded the way into the mountains that rose up behind Nibelheim. The other two soldiers were standing nearby, looking around to make sure no one wanted to start any trouble. There were a few more people to be seen now that the dragon had been killed. A few faces could be seen peeking out of windows and standing in doorways, curious to know what was going on. But still, no one dared to leave their homes, not as long as Shinra was still there. Only one man was brave enough to leave his home and to one side in the clearing near to Sephiroth, watching his every move with a concerned and almost tense look on his face. As Cloud saw him, he immediately felt that there was something strangely familiar about him and the way he looked. He was sure he knew him from somewhere, but he couldn't quite place it. Sephiroth looked up as Cloud ran up.
"Once the guide gets here, we're heading out,"
he said plainly to Cloud as the young boy skidded to a stop beside him.
Cloud nodded his head, relieved that he wasn't the only one who was late.
The man, who had been standing to one side, had remained silent up until that point, but as Sephiroth spoke he perked up and moved forward, the tense look on his face increasing.
"Listen to me, Sephiroth,"
he said curtly.
"In case something happens. Trust me,"
Sephiroth replied, waving a hand dismissively.
"It'll be all right, Dad. I have 2 men from Soldier with me."
The man, Cloud, and Sephiroth all turned towards the town at the sound of the light, cheery voice. The voice belonged to a young girl of about 16, and the moment he saw her Cloud gasped in both amazement and horror. She wore a smart red and white dress and had a large hat over her long brown hair, but nothing had really changed about her. She still appeared the same. Cloud was in awe, but was also horrified that his worst fears had been true. The girl looked around, a beaming smile on her fair face.
"I'm Tifa,"
she said cheerily.
"Nice to meet you." "Tifa!"
Cloud exclaimed, running forward.
"You're the guide?"
Tifa nodded, the smile remaining on her face.
"That's right,"
she said. She clasped her hands together in front of her.
"I just happen to be the #1 guide in this town."
She grinned at Cloud's surprised face.
"It's too dangerous,"
Cloud protested, shaking his head furiously.
"I can't involve you in something like this."
Tifa put her hands on her hips, almost ready to protest, but Sephiroth quickly interrupted them.
"Then there's no problem if you protect her,"
he said bluntly.
"Let's go."
He turned away and began to walk off towards the mountains, but as he did the young boy who had been standing shyly nearby until then suddenly ran forward, tightly holding the camera in his shy, little hands.
Mr. Sephiroth,"
he stammered nervously. Sephiroth came to a stop and slowly turned his head round to look at the boy, glancing at him through the long strands of silver hair. The boy held up his camera.
"Please let me take one picture for a memento. Tifa, can you ask him for me, too?"
Tifa looked at the boy's eager, hopeful face, and then nodded. She stood to one side, and Cloud moved so that he was standing beside her. Sephiroth, on the other hand, seemed a little more hesitant to get into the picture like Tifa and Cloud. He turned away for a moment, thinking, before eventually he made up his mind and stood beside Tifa. He didn't say anything or make any effort to smile, and just stood there blankly, waiting for it to be over. The young boy jumped for joy as he lifted the camera up to his eye, and focused on the 3.
"She's..."
The camera flashed as it took the picture, and the boy lowered his camera. The moment that it was over, Sephiroth quickly moved away, still showing no signs of emotion or caring for the boy's excitement.
"Great, thank you."
The boy thanked sincerely, hardly able to contain his excitement as he clutched the camera tightly against his chest. He smiled up at Tifa and Cloud, who smiled back.
"I'll give each of you a copy once I get it developed."
He then turned and ran off back towards the shop, wanting it to be developed as quickly as possible. And once he was gone,
Sephiroth and his group moved quickly through the back of the town and into the mountains of Nibelheim.
There wasn't much of a change in the mood between the town of Nibelheim and the mountains of Nibel. The entire mountain range was filled with a cold, dark mist that seemed to wind its way through the maze of mountains, choking the life out of everything that grew there. It was thought that the mist originated from the fumes that spewed out of the Nibelheim reactor, which was built deep within the mountains away from the town, but the mountains were always cold and misty. Like the town of Nibelheim itself, it was like a ghostly graveyard for the dead, with hardly any life in it apart from the monsters that lived there. For as long as Cloud could remember, the mountains of Nibel had always been cold, dark and foreboding. Hardly anyone ever went there, and those that did were never seen again. It was a dangerous place to be, and the only way to pass through the mountains were by traveling across the winding paths, and over the rickety old bridges that connected the mountains together.
A Mako reactor was built in Mount Nibel, explained Cloud. Thinking back, he could remember the thickness of the mist in certain parts. The cold air in the mountains of Nibel. It was no different.
Tifa was the one who led the way through the maze of mountain paths that wound their way throughout Mount Nibel. Cloud, Sephiroth, and the two Shinra soldiers followed her lead, since she was the only one who knew the whole way to the Mako reactor. Although she herself had never been inside, it was always locked up to prevent people from getting in. Eventually, she came to a stop at the end of a ledge on the first set of mountains within the range, and turned back towards the group. There was a deep crevice between the path they were on and the adjoining mountain, and only a long, old wooden bridge joined the two together. It didn't look particularly safe, but it was clearly the only way they were going to get across.
"It gets harder from here,"
she announced clearly to them all.
"Follow me."
With that, she turned and stepped up bravely onto the old, rotting bridge, without even a flicker of fear crossing her face. The bridge creaked loudly and swayed a little as she stepped onto it, but Tifa just ignored this and simply continued to walk up the bridge. Sephiroth followed her close behind and soon passed her, taking the lead in crossing the bridge. Cloud made sure he stayed as close to Tifa as he could, wanting to make sure that she didn't fall from the bridge. Each and every step they took across the bridge felt like a nightmare. The wooden planks were so old they looked ready to snap at any moment, completely worn out from years of being left to endure the harsh weather that ran through the mountains. Yet surprisingly, the bridge seemed to stay intact, and it looked as though they were going to be able to make it across the bridge to the other side without any trouble at all. Unfortunately, things were not going to go as they had hoped. The bridge was just too old to carry the weight of 5 people all at once. As Tifa took a step forward, she felt the bridge give a hefty shake, and a loud snapping sound could be heard from the ropes at the other end of the bridge.
The bridge!"
she cried out to warn everyone. The group on the bridge all looked around in a panic as they saw the frayed ends of the rope at the end of the bridge suddenly snap and fall away, releasing the wooden planks and letting them tumble away. The bridge jerked violently as gravity took over and began to pull it down towards the opposite mountain wall. Cloud was beside Tifa in a second, grasping her hand tightly as she lost her balance and clung onto the side of the bridge for dear life. Yet as the bridge lost its only link to the mountain and fell, he lost his own grip on the rope he was holding onto and fell, carrying Tifa with him. All he could see were white and dark blurs of the mountains, the faint images of others falling alongside of him. By the time they had finished their fall, Cloud and Tifa had both landed together at the foot of the mountain, lying limply on the harsh, rocky paths that lay even deeper beneath the mountains. As Cloud opened his eyes, he could see Tifa lying next to him, her hair covering her face, and her hat thrown off and lying in a crumpled heap beneath her head. He pushed himself to his feet, his body aching all over, amazed that he was still alive. At the same time Tifa also pushed herself up, brushing her hair out of her eyes and picking her hat up from the floor. She looked around, confused, before she finally met Cloud's gaze and sighed with immense relief. Before she could say anything, Sephiroth and one of the two Shinra soldiers walked up to them, also unhurt, although a little grazed from the fall.
"Everyone seems to be all right,"
Sephiroth said calmly, looking around. He flicked his silver hair out of his face, and turned to Tifa.
"Can we get back to where we were?"
Tifa looked around the area where they had landed. They had landed on a set of rocky paths at the foot of the mountains, a long way down from where they wanted to be. There was a cave entrance in the mountain nearby, which she thought might lead them to where they wanted to go. But she was not so familiar with this part of the mountains.
"These caves are intertwined, just like an ant farm,"
she said, looking down in thought. She looked around the group.
"Oh, and Sephiroth. There seems to be one person missing."
Slowly Sephiroth lowered his head.
"It may sound cold, but we've got no time to search for him,"
he told her simply, making no effort to hide the truth of the situation.
"We can't go back now, so we must go on."
He looked up.
"We'll travel together from here."
So they walked together up the path that led to the foot of the mountain they had landed by. Of course, now they were a long way from where they wanted to be, but they should still be able to make it to the reactor in plenty of time to solve the problem and make it back to Nibelheim without any more problems. There was a cave at the foot of the mountain, so with no other way to go, they went inside. Tifa gasped as she walked in, amazed by the inside of the cavern. The walls were old and rough, but they were also glowing slightly with a strange energy that changed into many faint and beautiful colors. She took a few steps ahead into the cave and looked around.
"What's this?"
Cloud asked.
"A mysteriously colored cave,"
Tifa whispered. Even though she whispered, her voice could be heard echoing softly throughout the paths of the cavern, reverberating off the walls back to her.
"It must be the Mako energy,"
Sephiroth assumed, walking up beside them, with arms folded, his mass immune sword resting at his side.
"This mountain is especially abundant in it. That's why the Mako reactor was built here."
He headed on into the cavern ahead of the group. Clearly, he wasn't impressed by the way the Mako energy flowed through the inside of the mountain, but it amazed Cloud and Tifa. On the outside the mountains were dead and lifeless, but on the inside it looked as though life was still trying to hang on. They had no time to stop and watch the beautiful glowing colors, however, for they soon had to run to catch up to Sephiroth as he reached the opposite end of the cave and stopped beside the cavern exit. When the two had caught up, they walked outside, where Tifa gasped again as another beautiful sight caught her eye. In the clearing ahead of them was a beautiful natural fountain that was filled with water. The strange thing about the water was that it had a gorgeous glowing aura, like a magical energy that flowed through it. It was so very rare to see something like a natural fountain, and even more rare to have water such as that flowing through it.
"And what's this?"
asked Cloud again, continuing to ask questions.
"A Mako fountain,"
Sephiroth explained to him.
"It's a miracle of nature." "It's so beautiful,"
said Tifa, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the glow. She walked up towards and stepped over the small rocky ridge that surrounded the fountain. The deep grooves of the fountain were filled with the glowing Mako, and were almost crystal clear. As she leaned over, she could see her reflection looking back at her with the same glowing aura, and she could feel that there was something mystical and miraculous about the fountain. Then her eyes saddened as she remembered the dead look of the rest of Nebel.
If the Mako reactor continues to suck up the energy, this fountain will dry up, too,
she mumbled sadly. Sephiroth walked up and stood beside her, followed closely by Cloud.
Materia,
Sephiroth said. He also looked into the Mako, and saw the three reflections of himself, Cloud and Tifa looking back at him.
When you condense Mako energy, materia is produced. It's very rare to be able to see materia in its natural state.
Tifa nodded and looked back into the fountain, feeling fairly sure that Sephiroth was deliberately avoiding answering her question. She knew it was true, though. Thanks to the reactors, everything around Nibelheim was dead, and it was only a matter of time before the Mako of this fountain disappeared too, and left behind a lonely fountain corpse dreaming of its past.
By the way,
Cloud said suddenly, remembering another question he wanted to ask.
Why is it that when you use materia you can use magic too?
Sephiroth glanced at him through his serious green eyes, and almost smiled. Almost.
You were in Soldier and didn't even know that?
He asked in disbelief. He shook his head and indicated the Mako in front of them.
The knowledge and wisdom of the ancients is held in the materia. Anyone with this knowledge can freely use the powers of the land and the planet. That knowledge interacts between ourselves and the planet, calling up magic. Or so they say. Magic?
Cloud whispered, looking deep into the shining pool of Mako energy.
A mysterious power.
Sephiroth stared at him for a moment, the corners of his mouth tugging slightly into what could have been a smile. Then, without any warning, he suddenly laughed out loud. Tifa and Cloud stared in amazement as Sephiroth laughed heartily in front of them, obviously finding what Cloud said extremely funny. Even so, Cloud was quite confused as to why Sephiroth was laughing.
Did I say something funny?
Sephiroth stopped laughing and looked at Cloud.
A man once told me never to use such an unscientific term such as mysterious power,
he said. The laughter was gone now, and the serious look had returned to his fair face.
I still remember how angry he was. Who was that? Hojo of Shinra, Inc.,
Sephiroth replied.
An inexperienced man assigned to take over the work of a great scientist. He was a walking mass of complexes. A Mako fountain,
Tifa interrupted, leaning over again. She wanted to reach out and touch the water, but another part of her didn't want to disturb its peaceful rest.
So this is where the knowledge of the ancients is.
While she was still looking, Sephiroth stood upright and moved away from the fountain, feeling that they had wasted enough time now looking at it. Cloud followed him, with the remaining Shinra soldier behind. Tifa stayed where she was for a few moments more, still thinking about how the fountain would one day dry up, and that she would like to see the fountain again before it dried up completely. She then realized that Sephiroth and the others were already beginning to go on ahead, so she quickly ran on to catch up with them. The rest of the walk up towards the reactor passed by with no more distractions, and they managed to catch up on the time that they had lost. As they finally came out of the last cavern and onto the long, winding path that led up to the top of the final mountain, they could see the old Shinra reactor lying ahead of them. The reactor indeed looked very old and worn after suffering many years out in the cold winds of Mount Nebel, and thick layers of rust were beginning to form across it. It was no wonder that it had begun to malfunction after all these years, and it probably needed to be completely rebuilt rather than just a quick repair. Tifa led the way all the way to the top, and when they finally reached it, she turned and smiled at everyone, her face slightly red from their steady climb.
"We finally made it," she said excitedly. "We sure took the long way through."
Cloud walked up to her.
"Tifa, you wait here. I'm going inside, too."
Tifa protested fiercely, shaking her head.
"I wanna see."
Sephiroth looked over at her as Cloud shook his head.
"Only authorized people are allowed in,"
he explained briefly to her.
"This place is full of Shinra's industrial secrets." "But..."
Sephiroth turned to the single Shinra soldier standing nearby.
"Take care of the lady,"
he ordered him. He and Cloud then headed up the stairs of the reactor towards the locked doors that blocked unauthorized entry. When they walked up, Sephiroth typed in the access code on the control panel beside the door, and it slid open to let them through. As they went through, Tifa made to follow them, determined to go in no matter what they said. Yet as she approached, the Shinra soldier ran up and stood at the bottom of the stairs, preventing her from passing. He held out a hand and shook his head at her. Angrily, Tifa stamped her foot against the ground.
Man!"
she wailed angrily. She turned and stormed off a few steps, before she turned back to the soldier with the angry look still on her face.
"Better take real good care of me then."
Inside the reactor, Cloud and Sephiroth moved quickly through the winding corridors that led towards the heart of the reactor. The reactor was made primarily for sucking up the Mako energy, so the builders never bothered with proper flooring and simply left the grated panels and pipes as a means of moving around. They moved quickly and steadily towards the final room at the back of the reactor where the main power pods were. All the many pods were lined up alongside each other, until they stopped by a single door at the top of the stairs. Seeing the door made Sephiroth pause for a moment, before he regained himself and moved quickly up the stairs towards the door. Even though all the power was contained in this room, the main control room lay beyond the door at the top of the stairs. Yet he was hesitant for some reason as he looked at the door. There was a large metal nameplate above the door, with the name Genova imprinted on it in bold letters.
"This is Genova, right?"
asked Sephiroth.
"The lock won't open."
He suddenly turned and moved back down the stairs, and stopped beside the first pod in the rows beside the stairs. He looked down at the pipes and valves that connected all of the pods together, before he nodded his head and turned to Cloud.
"This is the reason for the malfunction," he stated. "This port is broken. Cloud, close the valve."
Cloud did as he was ordered and went to the port, beginning to work on closing the valve so that no more Mako could leak out onto the floor. While he was working, Sephiroth went over to the other side and stopped beside the first of the pods, looking down in thought.
"Why did it break?"
he wondered aloud. He turned towards the pod, where the glowing light of the Mako inside could be seen. Curious to know more, he reached up and grabbed the rim of the window, pulling himself up so he could see inside. He then let himself drop down, a knowing look on his face.
"Now I see, Hojo,"
he muttered to himself, his voice quiet.
"But, even doing this, will not put you on the same level as Professor Gast."
He saw Cloud looking at him in bewilderment, so he turned and began to explain.
"This is a system that freezes and condenses Mako energy. That is, when it's working correctly. Now, what does Mako energy become when it's further condensed?"
Cloud scratched his head.
Oh yeah. It becomes materia." "Right, normally,"
Sephiroth said, nodding his head. He glanced at the pod.
But Hojo put something else in there. Take a look. Look through the window.
Slightly nervous Cloud walked over and climbed up the side of the pod to see through the window. His blue eyes then opened wide in absolute horror. Looking back at him through the window was a face, but it was no ordinary face. It was fairly human in appearance. It had 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth, but the rest of it was completely deformed and mutated. It was a monster. Cloud lost his hold on the window and dropped down to the ground, his body cold and shaking in fright.
WH! What is this?
He yelled. Sephiroth had turned away, his arms folded against his chest.
Normal members of Soldier are humans that have been showered with Mako. You're different from the others, but still human. But, what are they? They've been exposed to a high degree of Mako, far more than you.
Shakily Cloud climbed to his feet.
Is this some kind of monster? Exactly,
said Sephiroth.
And it's Hojo of Shinra that's produced these monsters.
He narrowed his eyes.
Mutated living organisms produced by Mako energy. That's what these monsters really are.
Cloud shook his head, unable to believe what he was hearing. He turned to Sephiroth.
Normal members of Soldier?
He asked.
You mean you're different?
He stopped as he saw Sephiroth, and stared. Beside him Sephiroth had turned away from him, and Cloud could see that his whole body was shaking slightly, although it was growing stronger. Sephiroth reached up and grabbed hold of his head, tugging at the long lengths of silver hair that hung from his head. He shook his head fiercely, his eyes glaring.
No?
He gasped, his voice quaking in both anger and fear.
Was I?
Cloud made to go to Sephiroth, but quickly stepped back as Sephiroth suddenly grabbed hold of his mass immune and pulled it out, swiping it swiftly against the pod. Cloud jumped back in a fright as the blade struck the side of the pod, cutting a deep, long scratch in its side. When Cloud landed on the ground, Sephiroth struck the pod another 2 times, an uncontrollable rage beginning to grow in him. Cloud could tell something was wrong.
Was I created this way, too?
Sephiroth asked, his green eyes small as he glared furiously at the silver surface of the pod.
Am I the same as all these monsters? Sephiroth!
He jumped violently as Sephiroth struck the pod again with his sword, cutting another deep scratch in its body. He then turned to Cloud, his eyes flared and angry, filled with rage.
You saw it!
He yelled.
All of them were humans. Humans?
Cloud exclaimed.
No way!
He remembered the faint human-like features of the monster in the pod that Sephiroth was striking. He couldn't believe it. Neither could Sephiroth.
I've always felt since I was small,
Sephiroth began, lowering his sword for a moment,
that I was different from the others. Special, in some way. But...
He clenched his fists tightly, the shaking beginning again.
Not like this.
A faint explosion sounded behind them, and the two turned up towards one of the higher pods. Smoke burst from the sides of the pod as the hinges were strained to their utmost peak. Inside the pod came the sound of an angry roar, and through the icy clouds inside Cloud could see an angry face reaching forwards, roaring angrily. The front of the pod then burst open and the door fell down towards the ground, releasing the creature trapped within it. It was indeed a human, although it was not a human anymore. Perhaps once it had been a human, but now, thanks to the extreme levels of Mako that it had been exposed to, it was now a monster. The monster lay on the open door of the pod and roared again, its normal human voice no longer able to work. Every ounce of its humanity had been lost forever. End of chapter. Episode 29, Part 02, Chapter 29. Chapter 29.
Am I human? I didn't quite understand what Sephiroth was saying at that time. I was even more surprised by the fact that Shinra was producing monsters.
Cloud paused for a minute and looked around at the faces of the others, examining their reactions. As usual, he could see the anger burning in Barrett's face as he struggled to contain his anger. This was just more fuel for the fire of his hatred for the Shinra. Eris was busy looking down at her boots, lost in thought. Red 13 was the same, looking away from Cloud and thinking hard. Lastly there was Tifa. She was still sitting on the bed closest to the window, a silent, sad look in her brown eyes.
Damn, Shinra!
Barrett exploded suddenly, making everyone in the room snap out of their thoughtful trances. They all looked at Barrett jumping madly on the floor, the wooden planks shaking beneath his feet. No doubt the people below could hear it, but Barrett didn't care.
The more I hear, the more I hate him. Who would have ever thought that the Mako reactor had a secret like that?
Asked Tifa.
That would certainly seem to explain the increase in the number of monsters recently,
Red 13 muttered thoughtfully. His tail gently swished across the floor, curling itself around the leg of a chair. Red 13 didn't seem to notice, and looked up at Barrett.
I think we should listen carefully to Cloud. Don't you think so, Barrett? Why you talkin' to me?
Barrett whispered sharply to Red 13. He then realized how loudly he had whispered and quickly turned away to hide his blushing face. He folded his arms and tapped the floor heavily with his boot. When he had finished pushing down the burning sensation in his face he turned back.
Yeah, maybe so.
He admitted. He then sighed heavily.
Wanna take a breather here?
The others all nodded. It had been a long story, and it wasn't finished yet. The group left the inn and separated from each other for a bit, and went to explore the quiet town of Calm. There wasn't much to explore. Calm was a very quiet town with very few shops and limited supplies. It wasn't a tourist town like towns from across the continent, just a simple town on the outskirts of Midgar, where people stopped and rested on their way to the city. After about 20 minutes the group reassembled in their room at the inn, ready to continue the story. Tifa was the last to arrive back at the inn. She had spent all her time sat in the middle of the town by an old well, watching all the people pass her by. Eventually she had become oblivious to the people walking around her, until a full 20 minutes had passed by and she realized that everyone else had already turned to the inn. When she arrived the others were all waiting for her.
I get it,
Barrett was saying as she walked up, finishing off a conversation with Red 13. They stopped talking as Tifa walked in and stood in her usual spot by the bed, waiting for the story to continue.
Tifa?
Eris said suddenly. Tifa looked up.
You were waiting outside then?
Tifa tilted her head.
Yes.
She asked.
We returned to Nibelheim,
Cloud began, interrupted Eris and preventing her from asking her next question. So she sat back on the bed beside Tifa and nodded at Cloud to continue with his story. Her question could wait.
Sephiroth confined himself at the inn. He didn't even try to talk to me. Then all of a sudden he just disappeared, right?
Asked Tifa. Cloud nodded.
We found him inside the biggest building in Nibelheim. The villagers used to call it Shinra Mansion,
Tifa added.
Long ago, people from Shinra used to live in that mansion,
said Cloud. The door to the inn opened as Cloud and the remaining Shinra soldier ran out into the street and looked around. They couldn't believe that no one had seen or heard Sephiroth leave the inn. He had slipped off completely without a trace. At that time of the morning the streets of Nibelheim were quiet, but the sense of calm that came after the defeat of the dragon had gone. In fact, it had intensified since their return from the reactor, and people remained safe inside their homes away from the Shinra. Cloud couldn't really blame them. Sephiroth had been acting very strangely since they returned. He hadn't said a word, and locked himself in his room. That was why Cloud was very worried to find Sephiroth had gone. The sound of men talking drew Cloud and the soldier towards the Shinra mansion at the north of the town. There were a number of people standing outside the old, rusty gates of the mansion, blockading it. One of those men was Tifa's dad, which didn't surprise Cloud one bit. He didn't trust the Shinra in the town at all, and trusted Sephiroth even less. He also recognized Zangan, Tifa's martial arts instructor, also guarding the gate. The group of men all looked up and scowled as Cloud and the soldier ran up, and quickly moved back into position around the gate. As they approached, Tifa's dad stepped forward and stood in front of Cloud, a distrusting scowl on his face.
"Until we know that there's no danger, we're not moving,"
he said simply, and walked back to his comrades and continued to block the gate. The Shinra soldier stepped forward, and the men moved just enough to let him through. They were prepared to let the Shinra through, but no one else. Even so, Tifa's dad scowled.
"There's nothing that'll harm this town, right?"
Zangan asked Cloud suddenly.
"No way,"
Cloud said positively, shaking his head.
"It's Sephiroth. He would never do that."
There was a quiet chortle from Tifa's father as he said that. He didn't believe a word of it. Even Zangan didn't look particularly convinced.
"Oh my,"
he muttered, scratching his head.
"You sure do have faith."
Cloud looked down at the ground uncomfortably. He did have faith in Sephiroth, and didn't believe that Sephiroth would harm his hometown. Even so, the grilling looks from the other men guarding the gates of the mansion made him uncomfortable. Shinra was never exactly popular, and even though he was from Nibelheim, it didn't change the fact that in their eyes he was another Shinra soldier.
"Why do you ask?"
he asked Zangan. Now it was Zangan's turn to feel uncomfortable.
"The Shinra showed up to eliminate any information that could be an embarrassment to the company,"
he explained. He gave Cloud a wink.
"You pick these things up when you travel as much as I do."
Slowly Cloud nodded. He couldn't really deny that. It was a sort of rule of the business world. The Shinra never really bothered with anything unless it was to do with money or would cause them embarrassment. To save further embarrassing himself, Cloud then headed into the mansion to begin his search for Sephiroth. The mansion was very quiet. There were no Shinra residents living in Nibelheim at that time, so the mansion was left abandoned. All the curtains were drawn and shutting off the light from the outside, apart from a thin beam of light where the curtains didn't quite meet, and shone onto the old oak floorboards. All in all, it was a very eerie old house, and the sense of unease ran all the way through the house. A loud creak made Cloud jump and turn towards the old stairs at the far end of the main hall. A flash of movement caught his eye, and Cloud saw a silhouette moving on the top balcony. He ran to the stairs and began to run up, but the moment his heavy boots stepped on the stairs they creaked. Cloud froze for a moment or two, his left foot hovering over the next step. He inhaled deeply and slowly lowered his foot onto the step. It still creaked, but not as loudly as before. Quickly but quietly he proceeded to move up the stairs until he reached the upper tier of the mansion. There were two ways he could go, left towards the bedrooms, or right, where the person he had seen went. Cloud cautiously headed towards the right, keeping his senses alert for any more signs of movement. As he turned the corner, he saw something moving ahead into another room at the end of the short corridor. Cloud reached behind him and gripped onto his large bladed sword. He wanted to be ready for anything. He then headed towards the room, and peeked around the door. When he pressed his foot down on the ground, it creaked suddenly, surprising both him and the figure that was standing in the room beyond. Hurriedly Cloud drew his sword and swished it in front of him, and the figure spun around, pulling out a gun, and aimed it at Cloud. Cloud stared, before he sighed with relief. The figure he had seen moving had only been the Shinra soldier who had gone into the mansion before he had. It was him that had been stalking around the mansion, and had scared Cloud half to death. Cloud lowered his sword, almost laughing.
"Don't do that,"
he said. He was sweating with anxiety.
"I thought you were Sephiroth."
In front of him, the Shinra soldier also lowered his weapon, and sighed.
"I'm sorry,"
he apologized. He put his gun back in its holster and stood upright. He put one gloved hand underneath the visor, shielding his face, and wiped it.
"There's no sign of Sephiroth, but I know I saw him go into this room."
Together they looked around at the room they were in. It was merely a small box room, and there wasn't much else in it apart from a cupboard, a chair, and a few other small things. There was a chimney shaft in the corner of the room, but there were no exits. If Sephiroth had indeed entered this room, there was no way he could have gotten out without anyone noticing. The soldier went over to a nearby wall and began to tap it gently, just in case there was a secret passage hidden. Cloud decided to do the same, and so they took a wall each and began to tap it, listening at any moment for a spot that sounded hollow. They moved slowly round and round, completing one wall and then moving on to the next. Yet everywhere they tapped gave back no hollow sound. Everywhere was secure, with no secret doors anywhere. Cloud reached the end of his wall and stopped by the chimney shaft. It was half embedded in the wall, joining all the other rooms together. It was built of an old, grey stone, and seemed pretty ordinary. As Cloud looked closer, however, he noticed something odd about the stonework. Some of the stones didn't seem to match the others, and didn't blend in as well. It was something that wouldn't be noticeable to anyone just entering the room, but up close the difference was clear. Carefully Cloud tapped on the stones that didn't look like they belonged. Just as he expected, a slight echo came back at him. The shaft was indeed hollow. He pushed against the stones, and they moved slowly backwards. Cloud grinned and grasped onto the edge of the wall, pushing it aside to reveal the hidden area beyond the well-concealed chimney shaft. Inside the chimney was a long spiral staircase, heading down deep into the depths of the house. It made Cloud a little dizzy to look down at how deep it went, and it was so dark he could only just see the bottom. He signaled to the Shinra soldier to stay put, before he stepped into the shaft and onto the first step of the staircase. The dim lights from the room upstairs gently lit Cloud's path as he headed down slowly into the hidden depths of the building. The Shinra soldier watched him from the top as Cloud descended into the shadows. Once Cloud vanished from view, he stepped back into the room, his gun in hand as he prepared to guard the entrance of the shaft. Cloud eventually reached the bottom of the long spiral staircase and stepped down onto the rocky ground. He was definitely well underneath the Shinra mansion now, there was no doubt of that. He was standing in the middle of a long rocky tunnel that ran all the way under the house. He could see the end of the tunnel not too far ahead of him, where it ended with a large door blocking the way forward. Cloud could feel the hair on the back of his neck standing on end as he walked slowly down the tunnel. The tunnel was deadly quiet and very shadowy, but a single light shining through the edges of the door at the end of the tunnel assured him that there was someone else there, and it was probably Sephiroth. After all, he couldn't think of anyone else who would be down here. He passed another closed door on his way down the tunnel, but one look made him realize that it was locked, and hadn't been opened in many years. He moved on and stopped outside door at the end of the tunnel. It was slightly ajar, and he could hear the sound of muttering inside. It was Sephiroth's voice. Nervously Cloud pushed open the door and slid inside. The hidden room looked like some kind of mini laboratory. There was a desk in the middle of the room with a number of old dusty papers and flasks on, and there were 2 large tubes in the corner. The laboratory was attached to a library, with a corridor lined with books adjoining the 2. Sephiroth's voice was coming from there, so Cloud stood in the middle of the laboratory and looked down. Sure enough, Sephiroth was standing in the middle of the tunnel, holding one of the many books open in his hands. There were already a number of books lying scattered across the floor that Sephiroth had flung down in his search, although who knew what he was looking for. He didn't even notice Cloud standing nearby, and continued to read the contents of the book aloud to himself.
An organism that was apparently dead, was found in a 2,000-year-old geological stratum, he read. Professor Gast named that organism Genova.
He turned the page over, his eyes focused only the book, and continued to read.
X year, X month, X day. Genova project approved. The use of Mako Reactor 1 approved for use.
He lowered his arm, letting the pages fall over his hand as he looked up at the ceiling. His green eyes seemed sad.
My mother's name is Genova? Genova project? Is this just a coincidence?
He looked down at the ground, towards the books around him.
Professor Gast. Why didn't you tell me anything? Why did you die?
He blinked and turned his head a little, finally noticing Cloud nearby. The sad look in his eyes was still there.
Let me be alone,
he said to Cloud, before turning away. Cloud stared as Sephiroth walked down towards the main part of the library, going back to his obsessive reading. There was nothing Cloud could do for him, so he turned and headed out of the room, leaving Sephiroth behind in the library.
Sephiroth didn't come out of the Shinra mansion,
Cloud said. He closed his eyes again, remembering.
He continued to read as if he were possessed by something, and not once did the light in the basement go out.
A few days passed by, and Cloud stared up at the ceiling of his new room. Thanks to the men of Nibelheim growing more concerned over the welfare of their town, not even Cloud and the remaining Shinra soldier had been allowed out of the mansion, just as no one else was allowed in. He had been down to the basement a number of times since he had entered the mansion, but each time Sephiroth had barely even noticed he was there. One thing Cloud did notice, however, was that the sense of unease and anxiety that ran through the house grew in intensity as the days went by, and the pile of books that Sephiroth left behind in his search grew ever larger. Eventually Cloud sat up on his bed, bored. He decided he'd try to talk to Sephiroth again, although he knew it was probably a waste of time. Sephiroth had been acting very strangely, and even he was beginning to get concerned. As he headed over to the room where the secret entrance lay, he found the Shinra soldier still waiting inside, sat on a chair as he continued to guard the room. The soldier looked up as Cloud entered, before he relaxed in his chair.
Sephiroth seems different,
he commented. He shuffled about with his visor, but didn't take off his helmet.
Hey!
He said suddenly, looking up at Cloud.
You don't think that he will? You know.
Cloud shook his head, although he was unsure of who he was trying to convince. The soldier seemed a little at ease though, and relaxed again in his chair. It didn't look like they'd be going anywhere for a while. As before, Cloud headed down towards the basement and into the library. He expected to see Sephiroth pacing back and forth as usual, with his pile of read books even larger than before. He expected to hear Sephiroth muttering quietly to himself as he read the contents of those books, and saying he wanted to be left alone. Yet as he walked into the library he was surprised to find that Sephiroth was not pacing around, and he couldn't hear Sephiroth's voice. Cloud walked fully into the room and looked around. The sound of a laugh made Cloud jump and turn to the corridor. He could see Sephiroth faintly at the desk in the library, but he wasn't reading. He was just sitting there silently, staring blankly into space. Cloud began to walk down the corridor towards Sephiroth. The sense of unease and panic suddenly began to rise in him as he walked, and with each step he took the hair on his neck froze, and the blood in his veins seemed to run cold. His heart thumped in his chest as he entered the library office and looked at Sephiroth.
"Who is it?"
Sephiroth demanded angrily. He looked up at Cloud, and Cloud's heart skipped a beat. There was something seriously wrong. Cloud could feel it in the air around him. Sephiroth's green eyes that were sad before were now angry, and seemed to get even angrier as they connected with Cloud's eyes. A scowl spread on Sephiroth's face.
"Humph! Traitor!"
Cloud blinked in surprise.
"Traitor?"
he asked. Sephiroth slammed his hands furiously onto the desk, directly on top of a pile of old reports that he had been reading over the past few hours. The fear in Cloud began to rise as Sephiroth stood up, pushing the chair back against the wall. Cloud swallowed hard, trying to push down the fear, but it was hard to contain.
"You ignorant traitor,"
Sephiroth growled.
"I'll tell you."
He lifted his head up and glared at Cloud with his furious green eyes, and Cloud could almost see the anger welling inside.
"This planet originally belonged to the Cetra. Cetra was an itinerant race. They would migrate in, settle the planet, then move on. At the end of their harsh, hard journey, they would find the promised land and supreme happiness."
Cloud watched in surprise as Sephiroth looked around the room at the many reports that had been scattered across the room, and the many books lying open on the floor around them.
"But, those that disliked the journey appeared,"
Sephiroth continued.
"Those who stopped their migrations, built shelters, and elected to lead an easier life. They took that which the Cetra had made without giving back one whit in return."
He stood upright and pointed straight at Cloud.
"Those are your ancestors." "Sephiroth!"
Cloud whispered, but he stopped there. He didn't know what to say. Sephiroth continued to rant.
"Long ago, disaster struck this planet. Your ancestors escaped. They survived because they hid. The planet was saved by sacrificing the Cetra. After that, your ancestors continued to increase. Now all that's left of the Cetra is in these reports. What does that have to do with you?"
Cloud asked, confused.
"Don't you get it?"
Sephiroth asked angrily, and Cloud jumped an inch back towards the wall. His nervousness only increased as Sephiroth began to slowly walk around the desk towards him.
"An ancient named Genova was found in the geological stratum of 2000 years ago. The Genova Project. The Genova Project wanted to produce people with the powers of the ancients. No, the Cetra. I am the one that was produced."
Cloud stared in horror.
"PR? Produced?"
he exclaimed. He shook his head fiercely, not wanting to hear any more of Sephiroth's story. It was all too freaky to grasp. Sephiroth nodded, a strange grin spreading on his face.
"Yes," he confirmed. "Professor Gast, leader of the Genova Project and genius scientist, produced me." "How? How did he?"
Cloud asked, although he was just as sure he didn't want to hear the answer.
It was then that some of Sephiroth's actions began to fit into place. The way Sephiroth had attacked the monster capsules in the reactor, they had been produced as well. The Genova nameplate above the door in the reactor. How Sephiroth had laughed when Cloud asked about his father. How could he possibly know who his father was, when there was no father? He was broken from his thoughts as Sephiroth suddenly moved past him and towards the door. There was something strange about the way Sephiroth moved, something very ominous and threatening. As he passed by Cloud, he could feel another sharp chill run down his spine, and his blood ran cold again.
S.E. Sephiroth?
Sephiroth paused at the entrance to the corridor. He didn't look back at Cloud, but Cloud could feel the cold chill of Sephiroth's eyes almost glaring at him.
Out of my way,
he said.
I'm going to see my mother.
With that, Sephiroth began to move again, heading down the corridor and out of the underground basement. Cloud remained stationary for a moment or two after Sephiroth left, unsure of what to make of the strange story. Sephiroth seemed to have completely changed in the space of a few days, and that thought scared Cloud. He suddenly shook his head and ran out of the basement, heading towards the man part of the house again. The Shinra soldier was not there when he emerged from the hidden staircase, although his gun was left lying on the floor. Cloud quickly ran out of that room and headed towards the main hall, when he heard a loud explosion from outside of the mansion. Cloud skidded to a stop, and prayed that what he saw from the dusty windows was not real. He tore down the stairs and towards the doors, pushing them open with all his might. Then he stopped as his eyes opened wide. End of chapter. Episode 30, Part 02, Chapter 30. Chapter 30. All Cloud could see was flames. There were flames everywhere. Wherever Cloud looked, he could see the burning red-orange color of flames, flickering over every part of the town. Every building, every house, and every structure, even the well in the middle of the town was alive with fire. Cloud could feel the heat of the flames, even as he stood in the doorway of the Shinra mansion. More than that, he was horrified to see his beloved hometown, where all his family and friends were, go up in flames. He broke from his horrified trance and ran out of the doorway towards the gate. The gate had been burst open from its hinges, and there was no sign of the men that had been guarding it. When Cloud ran out of the perimeter of the mansion, he ran straight through the wall of smoke that was beginning to clog up the town, and Cloud coughed as the dry heat of the smoke burned at his throat.
Hey, it's you. You're still sane, right?
Cloud looked over towards the local shop, and to his surprise he saw Zangan standing outside. He was kneeling beside the young boy that lived in the shop with his parents, the same boy that had wanted to take a picture of Sephiroth before they left for the reactor. The boy was badly burned, and from the looks of things it didn't look like he would make it. Even so, Cloud ran over, still unable to believe what was happening around him. He looked around and saw that the Shinra soldier was also nearby, lying on the ground seeming to be unconscious from the smoke.
I'll check this house,
he said, motioning to the shop behind him, which was also on fire.
You check that one over there.
With that, the martial arts master turned and braced himself before running into the burning shop. Cloud snapped around and faced the house that Zangan had designated him, and Cloud's eyes opened wide. It was his house. The house was alive with fire. Flames were pouring from the windows and burning through the wooden roof, along with a long trail of thick, black smoke. Without a single hesitation, Cloud ran through the open door and into his house. The heat of the flames hit him instantly, and Cloud cried out. He called out inside the house, but the flames had burned through the ceiling and caused the long wooden beams that held it up to crumble and fall,
blocking his path. Eventually, Cloud was forced to withdraw from the house. The heat was too much. He emerged from the smoking doorway coughing and spluttering. His eyes were watering heavily and each intake of breath was dry and hoarse. He fell down to his knees until his breathing calmed a little, when he looked up at the rest of Nibelheim. The inn was completely enveloped in flames, and there was no sign of Zangan or anyone else alive in the whole town. Judging from the amount of flames pushing out of the windows and chimney, it didn't look like the old couple that lived there would have survived, and Cloud highly doubted that Zangan would survive, either.
Terrible,
Cloud said, his voice dry and hoarse as he looked around at the burning devastation.
Sephiroth! This is too terrible.
He turned as the sound of angry shouting hit his ears. He turned back towards the mansion, and gasped as he saw Sephiroth standing there, along with two other men that had previously been guarding the gate. They were shouting at Sephiroth right then, but as Cloud watched, Sephiroth suddenly drew his mass immune and struck the two men. They were killed instantly by Sephiroth's expert touch, and fell to the floor. Cloud stared in horror, his hand still poised over his mouth. Sephiroth then looked up across the flames, and his gaze caught Cloud's. Looking into Sephiroth's eyes right then, Cloud could see that Sephiroth had completely changed. There wasn't a single flicker of the old, silent Sephiroth within him, replaced by something much darker than Cloud had ever seen. Sephiroth stared at him for just a few seconds more, before he turned and walked off through the wall of flames rising behind him, and disappeared. Once he was gone, Cloud climbed shakily to his feet and staggered over to the Shinra soldier lying near to his home. The soldier was moving slightly, he was still alive, for now. Cloud then looked up over the flames where Sephiroth had disappeared. He knew where Sephiroth was heading. The Mount Nibelmako reactor was still intact when Cloud finally reached it, much to his surprise. He had no doubt in his mind that Sephiroth was somewhere inside the building, and Cloud prayed that he was alone. He didn't really know what he was going to do when he finally caught up to Sephiroth. All he knew was that his hometown was up in flames and everyone he knew was gone. He was seething in anger, and all he could think of was finding Sephiroth. He burst through the door and stopped as he heard the sound of a familiar voice within the reactor, but it wasn't Sephiroth's voice. It was a girl's voice, and it sounded like she was crying. Cloud stayed still and listened to the voice, until it finally hit him who it was. He looked over the top of the pipe and saw her there, sobbing on the ground. It was Tifa. She was kneeling beside her father, who was lying on the ground in a pool of blood. Sephiroth's long sword was lying on the ground next to them, stained with her father's blood. Cloud headed slowly down the pipes towards where Tifa kneeling, but he didn't get too close to her. He stopped on the bridge and looked at her tearful face, which was red and streaked. As he watched, she wiped her hair out of her face, and gently touched her father's head.
"Papa,"
she whispered, her voice choking.
"Sephiroth! Sephiroth did this to you, didn't he? Sephiroth! Soldier! Mako reactors! Shinra! Everything!"
She sat up and shouted at the sky.
"I hate them all!"
Once she had calmed her rage, she looked down at the ground again. Her gaze fell on the long and thin silver sword that was lying on the ground beside her dead father. Slowly, she reached out and took hold of the handle. Her expression changed to a fearless determinism, and she got up and ran through the door. Cloud followed her, hoping he would get to her on time. Sephiroth was already in the capsule chamber when Tifa entered. He stood in front of the Genova door, his arms spread wide. There was a strange, happy grin on his face as he stood in front of the door, like a lost boy returning home.
"Mother, I'm here to see you,"
he said, speaking up to the door where his mother's nameplate was positioned.
"Please open this door."
A loud thud made Sephiroth lower his arms and turn towards the entrance to the chamber. Tifa charged into the room and began to bolt up the stairs towards him, his own sword positioned ready in her hands. The sword seemed bulky and awkward in her hands, but that didn't stop her from running up to him.
"How could you do that to Papa and all the townspeople?"
she demanded angrily. She ran to the very top step where Sephiroth stood and swung the sword down, her rage out of control as she tried to strike off Sephiroth's head. As she brought the sword down, Sephiroth reached out and grabbed hold of her arms, stopping her from swinging the sword any further. He gripped harshly at her wrist as he pushed her, and Tifa struggled hard to keep the sword in her hands. Eventually, the pain around her wrists was unbearable and she had no choice but to release the sword. Sephiroth grabbed the sword instantly and let go of her. Tifa staggered and looked up, her eyes opening wide as she saw the flash of the blade coming down towards her. She never even had a chance to cry out as the blade hit her hard. As the blade cut down, she fell back away from the platform, almost flying through the air towards the stairs. Through her half-closed eyes she could see the trail of blood in the air that was seeping from her neck and shoulder where Sephiroth had cut her. She landed with a thud on the stairs, her head banging on the edge and stunning her so she could no longer feel the pain of the wound. She seemed to bounce off the step and flew once more, before she landed again just as heavily and slid quickly towards the bottom platform. She laid there, her eyes blurred and heavy, gasping quietly under her breath as she felt the cold trail of blood run down her arm. Cloud ran in just in time to see Tifa land on the final steps, and stared as she lay motionless. His jaw fell open, he could not believe what was happening. Outside the door, Sephiroth lowered his sword, now stained with Tifa's blood, and looked back at Cloud with a smug expression. The sword struck her hard, and Sephiroth let go of her. Tifa closed her eyes and fell back away from the platform, almost flying through the air with a trail of blood seeping from her neck and shoulder where Sephiroth had struck her. She landed on the stairs and almost seemed to bounce right off, before she landed again. She then slid down the stairs towards the bottom where she stopped, just as Cloud ran in. He gasped as he saw her lying there, with Sephiroth at the top with a smug expression. He then turned away, and the door to the inner chambers opened. Sephiroth walked through, leaving Cloud behind. Once he was gone, Cloud slowly walked up the few steps to where Tifa's body lay. He winced as he saw the slashed wound on her body, and the blood that was still seeping slowly out of it. Her chest heaved up and down, she was still alive, but it didn't look like she would make it either. Slowly Cloud sank to his knees and brushed her hair away from her face. At his touch, Tifa slowly opened her eyes and looked up at him, and a faint smile appeared on her face.
"You promised,"
she whispered, her voice quiet. She took a deep breath, straining for each breath.
"You promised that you would come when I was in trouble."
She slowly lifted one small, trembling hand, and Cloud took it in his own. She was still warm to the touch, and the trembling eased as he held her. She coughed slightly and closed her eyes again. Cloud released her hand and gently slipped his hand under her head, pulling her up slowly. With his other hand under her legs, he scooped her up in his arms and carried her away from the stairs. He put her down again beside one of the capsules, positioning her in a way that would slow the bleeding a little. By then Tifa was unconscious, and could feel nothing. Then, When she was safe, Cloud ran up the stairs and into the inner chambers. At that moment Sephiroth was inside the chamber, his arms spread wide in front of a strange structure built into the Mako reactor. He was standing on a large pipe that rose all the way up to the structure and penetrated it, filling rapidly with a red substance sucked up from the earth. The structure he was standing in front of was human in shape, but made of a strong metal. Pipes shaped like wings emerged from its side, and more pipes surrounded it. There was an almost loving look in Sephiroth's eyes as he stood there, his sword in one hand, praising the metal figure.
"Mother,"
he said, a loving tone in his voice as he addressed it.
"Let's take this planet back together. I've thought of a great idea. Let's go to the Promised Land."
He received no reply from the statue, but the loving look in his glowing green eyes just increased. As though he didn't need an answer. It was then that Cloud ran into the chamber, a look of pure fury in his blue eyes as he glared up at Sephiroth.
"Sephiroth! My family! My hometown! How could you do this to them?"
he yelled. A small scowl appeared on Sephiroth's face, and the loving look in his eyes disappeared and became blank. He slowly lowered his arms and looked down at the ground. Cloud panted heavily, his heart beating loudly in his ears, the fierce rush of adrenaline powering his anger. A moment's silence spread between him and Sephiroth, until he heard a small chuckle come from Sephiroth, and he growled.
"Ha, ha, ha!"
chuckled Sephiroth, not looking up from the floor.
"They've come again, Mother."
He raised his gaze up towards the metal statue, and the look of love and compassion returned to his eyes again.
With her superior power, knowledge, and magic, Mother was destined to become the ruler of this planet.
He slowly stepped forward onto the top of the pipe, and his arms slowly began to reach out for the statue. A strange and almost manic grin spread on his face as he reached up to the statue's face.
"But they,"
he said, his voice ominous and full of hatred.
"Those worthless creatures are stealing the planet from Mother."
He drew closer to the statue, his face almost level with its own face.
"But now I'm here with you,"
he said to it.
"So don't worry."
He suddenly grabbed onto the edges of the metal statue and pulled harshly. His own superior strength caused the metal casing to jerk, and the pipes strained and broke away from the statue. Another final tug from Sephiroth brought the casing away completely, and Sephiroth held it up in his arms. The energy that was being pumped into the statue began to pour from the pipes and from its mouth like blood, the statue giving its last breath before Sephiroth threw it callously down towards the ground, where it clattered and rolled to a stop near to where Cloud stood. It wasn't the statue he was interested in. Cold steam poured from the pipes, but soon began to clear. Sephiroth looked up and peered through the steam, a smile spreading on his face as he saw what he wanted to see. The steam cleared to reveal a glass panel, sealing off the interior. Inside the panel was a woman, seeming to be only kept alive because of the pipes attached to her body. She had dark blue skin, but one of her eyes was replaced by a mechanical red light. Attached to her head was a large metal helmet, with a copper nameplate nailed onto it. Written on that nameplate was the name Genova written on it. On the ground, Cloud drew his sword and held it firmly in his hands.
"What about my sadness?"
he demanded fiercely.
"My family? Friends?"
He closed his eyes, remembering Tifa lying almost dead in the reactor.
"The sadness of having my hometown taken away from me? It's the same as your sadness." "Ha, ha, ha! My sadness?
asked Sephiroth. He turned to Cloud and raised his arms high.
What do I have to be sad about? I am the chosen one. I have been chosen to be the leader of this planet.
He made a single, fleeting glance back to the encased body of Genova and smiled, before he looked back at Cloud and clasped his sword in both hands.
I have orders to take this planet back from you stupid people for the Cetra. What am I supposed to be sad about?
Cloud lowered his head and looked down at the ground. Tears were stinging in the back of his eyes. His hometown, his friends, and his mother. Everyone and everything he knew was gone. He had left Nibelheim to be as strong as Sephiroth. Now all the respect that he had had for Sephiroth was gone, as were his dreams of being like him. Now all he could feel for Sephiroth was anger. A blazing, furious anger that surged through his veins and made him burn inside. He wanted to take revenge for what Sephiroth had done to his town, and that was the only thing on his mind.
Sephiroth! I trusted you,
he mumbled quietly. He looked up at Sephiroth and raised his sword, ready for battle.
No, you're not the Sephiroth I used to know.
He continued to glare up at Sephiroth, the ferocious anger burning in his eyes, his body tensed and ready for battle, even if it meant death. Sephiroth did nothing but look back at him, his mass-immune sword clasped in his hands. Now it was a stalemate between them, waiting to see who would make the first strike, and who would die in trying. Cloud flexed his grip, and prepared to swing his sword.
And that's the end of my story,
Cloud said suddenly, ending the story. All around him the others jumped in surprise at the sudden end to the long story. They looked around at each other, confused.
Wait a damn minute!
Barrett snapped furiously, jumping up from where he was sat.
Ain't there more?
Cloud shook his head.
I don't remember. What happened to Sephiroth?
Asked Eris.
In terms of skill, I couldn't have killed him,
replied Cloud. Tifa looked up from the bed.
Official records state Sephiroth is dead, she said. I read it in the newspaper. Shinra, owns the paper,
Eris pointed out.
So you can't rely on that information. I want to know the truth,
said Cloud, thinking hard as he tried to fill in the gaps in his memory.
I want to know what happened then. I challenged Sephiroth and lived. Why didn't he kill me?
Tifa raised her hand.
I'm alive, too,
she added. Cloud looked up at her and nodded, but he looked a little concerned. He couldn't remember anything after the moment when he and Sephiroth were about to fight. He had thought Tifa would have died after a wound like that, but she was also here by his side.
Seems like a lot of this doesn't make sense, said Eris.
She stood up and went to the window, scratching her head thoughtfully.
What about Genova?
She asked, looking out of the window at the townspeople.
It was in the Shinra building, right? Shinra shipped it from Nibelheim to Midgar,
Cloud informed her.
Did someone else carry it out after that?
She asked further.
It was missing from the Shinra building. Sephiroth.
Tifa suggested.
Damn. Don't none of this make sense?
Barrett shouted suddenly. He rubbed his scalp madly with his hands until it was sore, for he was completely confused and wanted some relief.
I'm gone. And I'm leaving the thinkin' to you.
He turned around and plodded over to the top of the stairs.
Yo, Cloud. Let's get a move on. Right,
agreed Cloud, nodding.
Yo, come on let's go.
Barrett said. Then he turned and thudded down the stairs, deliberately slamming his boots against the wood to make some noise and relieve his frustration. When he was gone Cloud put a hand to his head and shook it pitifully.
Oh, brother. Cloud.
Cloud looked up as Tifa walked over to him. She stood in front of him almost sheepishly, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, and shuffling the floor with her feet nervously.
How bad was I when Sephiroth cut me?
she asked him. Cloud blinked, and the image of Tifa lying on the stairs covered in blood returned to his mind. He cringed. He didn't want to remember that image.
I thought you were a goner, he admitted.
He looked down at the ground.
I was really sad.
Tifa looked down at the ground as well, her face red. Was all she could muster. Eris was still by the window, looking out at the townspeople. Cloud's story had made her think about an awful lot of things. Up until that point she had always believed that she was the last surviving member of the Cetra. Now she knew that she wasn't, if Sephiroth was indeed still alive. She didn't know much about the Cetra other than what she had already told everyone. She closed her eyes for a moment and quietened her mind. Since they had left the busy, mechanical streets of Midgar, she had begun to sense and hear a lot more of what the planet was saying, things she had never been able to sense whilst in the slums of Midgar. It was still very weak, but she knew one thing, the planet was in chaos.
The ancients. Cetra. Genova. Sephiroth and myself.
She whispered.
Let's go,
Tifa announced suddenly.
Barrett's waiting.
She and Cloud headed for the stairs and went down to the ground floor. Eris remained behind for a moment longer, watching the innocent people of Calm continue with their daily lives, probably unaware of the tragedies that occurred in Midgar. She then turned and followed them down, leaving Red 13 alone in the bedroom. He waited until everyone had gone, where he swished his tail on the floor.
What a fascinating story,
he commented. He then crawled slowly to his feet and headed down after the others. Barrett was waiting for them all when they finally came down from the inn's bedroom. He seemed to have calmed down a little now, although the innkeeper and his assistant both looked a little pale and shell-shocked. They didn't want to even imagine what Barrett must have said to them to scare them so much. He was holding a small item in his large hands, and when he looked up and saw Cloud and Tifa head down, followed by Eris, he stopped tapping his foot and headed over to them.
Yo, Cloud. Here.
He said, and chucked the small item over to Cloud. Cloud caught the item and looked down at it. He had seen an item like this before. It was a PHS, or personal homing system. They were often used in the Shinra for troops to keep in touch with one another, but were only in best use over short distances. It would be very useful for them traveling across the plains.
PHS will put us in constant contact with each other,
Barrett explained, completely disregarding the look of recognition in Cloud's face.
Alright then, we're outta here.
He then ran out of the doorway, with Red 13 close behind him, before Cloud could protest. They hadn't even decided on their next destination yet. So he just sighed and walked out of the inn with Eris and Tifa, and back into the town of Calm. There were a few more people around now, for the sun was higher in the sky and most of the shops had now opened up. There was no sign of Barrett or Red 13 in the town, they had already left for the Midgar plains that surrounded the town of Calm. He wasn't worried about them, though, for they were perfectly capable of handling the monsters that roamed the fields by themselves.
Listen to me,
came a man's voice. Tifa and Cloud both looked up and saw him nearby with a group of people, speaking very loudly and attracting a lot of interest.
Just now, some guy in a black cloak walked east towards that grassy field. And he's got this killer sword, and is looking real scary.
Cloud and Tifa both stopped in surprise and stared at one another, wondering if what they were hearing was really true. A guy in a black cloak with a killer sword.
Cloud,
said Tifa looking up at Cloud nervously.
Could it be Sephiroth? I mean, could he really still be alive? Really? He isn't dead. You remember what Palmer said, right?
Cloud told her.
Sephiroth was in the Shinra building. He killed the president.
He looked out towards the entrance of the town.
So it looks like he's heading away from Midgar.
He crossed his arms and tapped his foot thoughtfully against the floor.
Hey, maybe we should get going,
Eris interrupted suddenly, walking between Cloud and Tifa.
We don't want to fall too far behind Barrett and Red 13. Cloud, maybe you should call them and tell them which way to head.
Cloud looked at her. She sounded a little anxious, but Cloud couldn't make out why. Eventually he nodded and pulled out the PHS. End of Part 2. Part 3, Chocobos, Parades, and a Ninja. End of chapter.